Thank you. So we're really changing gears from the previous presentation, and much of this is not going to be on malaria. I did let Aubrey know that I have a different role now at WHO, but there are three elements to the talk. The first part is an update on the malaria vaccine pilot implementation project that we're leading at WHO with the RTSS vaccine. For my first 5 years at WHO, I was the malaria vaccine lead. And then I'm going to go branch out into some broader topics and hopefully convince you that this is of interest to you, but you can let me know at the end if I was right. So on to RTSS. So I'm sure you all will have read papers and be interested in the current status with this vaccine. So my role was to guide the process at WHO for the evidence synthesis leading into the policy assessment, which occurred in 2015. And this is the display on the DeLorean time machine in Back to the Future. So what's the link between a DeLorean and RTSS? Well, I was interested in this coincidence in that the date that we actually made the policy decision turned out to be the date that at the end of Back to the Future, if you remember, if any of you were a teenager in the mid-'80s like me, Back to the Future was quite an important film. Right at the end, they whiz off into the far distant future, which was this utopia that they come back from, where everybody's in flying cars and everything's fantastic. And the far distant future is where we're now living, because they headed off to October 2015. And this is when we were making the policy decision. Now, interestingly, around the time that Back to the Future was being made, it was the relatively early days of recombinant DNA technology. They'd already identified the circumsporozoite antigen. And I think if you talk to I wasn't working on malaria vaccines quite that far, but if you talk to people in the early 90s, and certainly if you read the literature, they were talking about 5 to 10 years for developing a malaria vaccine. Unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. I am a firm believer in malaria vaccine development, so I still believe that we will get there. But the decision from this group in WHO was that the evidence didn't quite yet support the widespread rollout of this malaria vaccine, and they called for these pilot implementation studies. So SAGE is the highest level immunization group at WHO for vaccines, and MPAC, the equivalent for malaria. And they came together and they jointly recommended phased implementation of the RTSS malaria vaccine. Subnationally, they felt that this is potentially a promising vaccine, but we needed more information. And some of the reasons that they felt that we needed more information were that it seems that we need 4 doses of the vaccine to achieve optimal benefit. The data from the phase 3 trials indicate. And there were so one big question was that new visits will be needed, new contacts will be needed. And so a big question is feasibility of being able to reach reasonable coverage with the schedule for this vaccine that's outside of the routine EPI visits. There were also questions about safety and impact, as well as health economic questions. And so what we've been asked to focus on in the evaluation are these 3 questions: feasibility of administration, impact, and safety. This is a high-level overview of the design, where areas within 3 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Kenya, Ghana, and Malawi, have been identified for the pilot implementation, and clusters have been identified. So these are at different levels within the country. Some of them are districts or counties. And then there's a lot of work going in with the countries to set up standardized monitoring systems in all of the clusters to monitor safety and survival. And then there'll be randomization at this cluster level, and either introduction of RTSS through the routine API program, importantly, or not. This is one slide from which, so Mary Hamill took over from me as the lead in WHO for seeing the pilots through, working in the vaccines department. And this is the work of the vaccines department, the global malaria program, together with the essential medicines department. This gives you an overview of the anticipated timelines, where we're still hoping that the vaccinations themselves will start sometime in the middle of 2018. We'll then start to see safety data accruing, and we have a series of research protocols which will lead to data on all of these different questions, including administrative coverage data, evaluation of the actual vaccination through the EPI program, some qualitative data on whether there's going to be modification on access to treatment, as well as use of existing malaria control measures, health economic studies, and an impact element, which is the primary outcome of these studies, which is focusing on a system for community-based mortality surveillance, as well as sentinel hospital surveillance for particularly looking at cerebral malaria and meningitis. So this all should lead to the generation of data for decision-making in 2022. And you can imagine that this is going to be really a very rich data set. So the team is going to be looking to work out how we can feed the data that's going to be coming out of these very large studies. We're talking about several hundreds of thousands of children that will be vaccinated, and how we can work with the research community, including the modeling community. I think the health economic data is going to be particularly important, and there is a possibility that the preliminary data that comes out before the anticipated end of this program could be enough for us to start to modify the current policy situation. And if it turns out that the feasibility data and the safety situation looks good, then there's a possibility that there'll be an early look in 2020. Okay, so that's the malaria part of the talk. I'm now going to become quite a bit broader, which is a lot of the rest of my work. So this is just an outline of some of the timelines that we normally see with vaccine development in general. It generally takes 10 to 20 years. I mean, it's clearly highly variable, going from the very first clinical trial of a new vaccine to having information for introduction in developing countries. And I just would like to explain the background to another area that I work in a lot, which is the epidemic R&D work at WHO, something called the R&D Blueprint for Action to Prevent Epidemics. This is what happened in the 2014 to 2015 Ebola crisis, where the public health emergency of international concern was declared. Actually, before it was declared in August, GSK came to see us in April, and Mary-Paul Keeney has stated publicly previously that they said to us that they happened to have acquired a biotech entity called the Kairos, and they had access to a technology they thought could be used in Ebola, but hadn't been tested in a single individual. So we had a clinical safety database of 0, and we were asked, how can we interact in this context where an outbreak was emerging? We didn't have any way to do that, and this has changed now. So this R&D blueprint is WHO putting in place a system to be able to interact outside business as usual with various external constituencies for outbreaks. I think one of my main messages for you all is that really to reflect on how we can ensure that we have some better interaction between the endemic research communities, such as the malaria research community, and the epidemic research. Because what I see is that politically, the epidemic R&D is high on the agenda now. AMR R&D is currently high on the agenda. Clearly, the overall public health burden will continue to be highest from some of the big endemic pathogens that you all work on, like malaria, HIV, TB. There are some major synergies for working between these two spaces and capitalizing on the political interest on the epidemic side. So I think you could see this timeline, 11 months, from the emergency being declared to demonstration of efficacy in a trial in Guinea. On the one hand, you could see this as a big success. On the other hand, you could see it as a failure of the system, because it was too late. It was too late for that vaccine to be really deployed at the peak of the outbreak. And if we had the phase 1 data in August, we would have been able to go straight into effectiveness evaluation. That's shortening that time frame is what underlies a lot of the work in the blueprint. This is the Guinea efficacy trial that we coordinated from WHO, and I'll just click through these. These are all the decision points that occurred with the global community during Ebola. And I think the high-level message I have is that from when we were approached, so we were approached by the Guinean authorities, who said to us there were already plans in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and they wanted to evaluate vaccine in their country as well. So we put together a global group of Ebola scientists, vaccine scientists, but also general methodologists who were really very important to advise on the best way to evaluate vaccine in Guinea for efficacy. The protocols, the financing all came into place. This ring vaccination design was agreed. And it was 9 months from when we started the planning to when we got the preliminary results that showed the 16 versus 0 efficacy. And I think that the key innovation here probably came more from the methodologists than the topic experts, which was that we needed to find a way for the trial design to follow the outbreak geographically. There was no way that we would have been able to demonstrate efficacy with a fixed site trial. But because we were enrolling, so this is a particular case of a cluster randomized trial, where the cluster is not a geographic area, it's the contact structure around a confirmed case of Ebola virus disease, so the contacts and the contacts of the contacts. So we're enrolling where the confirmed cases were occurring, a very wide geographical area. And if we had a fixed site trial, we never would have got an answer. And this was the headline result with a point estimate of 100% and a CI down to 75% published in The Lancet, and no case of Ebola virus disease that occurred more than 10 days after vaccination of a single dose with this vaccine. So, so we have an Ebola vaccine now. It's still not licensed, but it will go through that process. And right now we have investigational stockpile, and we have plans in place so that if an Ebola outbreak occurs in other settings, we could work with partners to deploy the investigational vaccine. This then led to the setting up of this R&D blueprint, where this was us at WHO working with all of our advisors to say, how can we make sure this doesn't happen again? And how can we go from this boom and bust cycle that we always see in outbreaks, where there's a big political interest, there's lots of resources. Usually the resources all become available when the outbreak is finishing, and harness that energy in the inter-outbreak period to put things in place that will accelerate timelines when the outbreak occurs. These are the 3 sets of work streams that we have in the blueprint. And just as an example, I mean, I'm going through a lot in this talk, but I just thought I'd try and touch on quite a few areas that some of you might find interesting. So we decided that following developing a list of priority pathogens. These are all viral pathogens that may emerge and cause serious outbreaks in future. And these pathogens are important in their own right, but also because they are representative of viral families. So we think that the R&D in a certain pathogen may be applicable and useful beyond that pathogen alone. We are then developing these product development related research agendas, essentially. That's what these roadmaps are. The first one we developed was for MERS coronavirus, where we convened about 100 MERS coronavirus experts in WHO, and this was published in Nature Medicine. And we're going through this process for the list of the other pathogens. And I should stress that, of course, everybody knows that the next big really serious international outbreak will probably happen with a pathogen that isn't on anybody's list. So as far as possible, we're doing whatever can be done to develop enabling frameworks which are not pathogen-specific, but some of it does need to be pathogen-specific. Related to this, we're developing target product profiles, and I think this is an innovation from WHO, where rather than waiting for the evidence to come to us and then assess it 20 years later, we're sort of coming out from around the table and trying to engage with the development community to say, these are the priority non-existent products that we actually would like to be developed. And unlike in malaria, which is obviously a hugely complex technical barrier for product development, some of these viruses are not so challenging for product development. So just by actually laying out what we actually want, we think may accelerate the timelines. We have 6 sets of these vaccine target product profiles in this outbreak space. We have an equivalent document already for malaria vaccines, which in some ways was a prototype for some of this work, called Malaria Vaccine Preferred Product Characteristics. Something else that I wanted to mention is I ended up getting engaged in this, going from a very narrow area where I was working on a particular project and particular protocols, to really being faced with some of the systemic barriers that we faced to progress. And one of them was certainly, how do you share information? I mean, everything that we do in a new outbreak and in public health in general is based on the information that a lot of you are generating. Everything is data-based, but if we don't have access to the information, then we can't make decisions based on the information. And what we very much saw during Ebola was there were some really complex barriers to sharing information. We saw that some of the information wasn't shared widely for journal embargo reasons, which seemed really completely unacceptable in the middle of Ebola, where things were changing every day. And there were various other complex issues. So we convened the community to really try and put in place some ways we can try to overcome some of these barriers. And a lot of them are not simple to overcome. One of these, and this is not a claim that this is going to fix the issue, but we did write to the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors and point out that if you look at what was on their website, it was true that it wasn't clear that you wouldn't get into trouble if you shared your findings before the publication date. And we said that in an acute public health event, I mean, this is just not okay. We have to be able to share the information. We cannot be waiting until the journal embargo date. So we said, please change this, and they did. And this is a red line on the ICMJ website. So they have replaced that with a very clear wording that during a public health event, it's expected, and we want this to be the norm. We see this as the norm. It is expected that you've demonstrated that you have shared the information before it is published, rather than the other way around. A bit related to this, and not specific to outbreaks, but covering all of clinical trials, we've seen that there continue to be really major patchiness in how clinical trial results are disclosed. And RCT results are so important for evidence-based decision-making. In the grade system, you prioritize RCT, for those of you who work in evidence. So the fact that we know that somewhere between 30 and 50% of all clinical trials, this is not in malaria, but this is, people have looked multiple times. We now have over 100 studies of publication bias. We have systematic reviews of publication bias. And these repeatedly show that whether they're small or large trials, whichever product class you look in, whichever disease you look in, there's something like 30% would be on the lower end of the figure of all of the RCT database just isn't available for anybody to make decisions. So we convened the leading funders in WHO earlier this year, and we put to them that we really need to have a system in place that ensures that in some time frame, each funder decides what their time frame is going to be, that somebody should be following up and ensuring that the results are made available. This is more complex for the negative trials, where we know that there's less incentive and it's more difficult to publish the negative results. But we also know that some of the registries now provide you with ways of disclosing the negative results. So clinicaltrials.gov now has 20,000 clinical trials where you can look at the results in the summary results section. And there is a whole literature on this. And as far the status that has got to at the moment seems to indicate that the results in clinicaltrials.gov are as useful for decision-making as the results in the journals, because they follow this pro forma. Just like in Consort, you follow a pro forma for putting the results into clinicaltrials.gov. So of course we expect journal publication is going to continue because it's so important for careers, etc. But let's think also about just making sure that we have all the information. And what was very heartening was that when we put this to all of these funding groups, they all really saw the importance of this and showed some leadership. In the UK, DFID, MRC, the National Institute of Health Research, and the Wellcome Trust have all committed to this. So we'll be convening them again in May next year to see how the policies are progressing. Now, finally, in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about yet another. I mean, if I've been at 35,000 feet now, I'm now going up into orbit. But I'll see if I can take you with me. So just, what's the background here for global health R&D? I mean, you all know this, I think, but I'm just going to state what to me are some truths. Many millions die avoidably each year from infectious diseases and NCDs, non-communicable diseases in developing countries. The analyses show that about 1% of health R&D is spent on infectious diseases most important for developing countries. If R&D allocation was directly followed the public health need, clearly that figure would be very different to that. What we generally see is that access to products occurs first in high-income countries or wherever there are markets that can pay for them. And generally, the public health need is not always, but generally it's focused on developing countries. So what follows from that is that access to new products is inversely related to the need for those products, generally, geographically speaking. And we also, as I said before, there's a big literature that shows that information from previous research is only partially available when decisions are made. And this leads to all sorts of biases. So, is this hopeless? Not at all. I think there's a lot that we can do, and there's a lot that you're all doing to try to address some of these inequities. I think if there's inequity is absolutely critical to the World Health Organization. I mean, that's why we exist. So this is a standard pathway for developing products that I don't need to go through: developing, testing, licensing, policy making, and then purchasing, using the products. Right now, where we are is that in some ways, in some disease areas, for some product classes, we have found there's been major progress over the last 20 years to enable access to products with the advent of Gavi, the Global Fund, UNITAID, major investments by many donors. But what that has done is major progress from this traditional pathway that we still largely have to try to reduce the delay before we have access to products in developing countries. If you look at where we are now, one of the things that we're interested in, and there's a big community that is interested in this, is really trying to look at how we can incrementally improve the system that we currently have. And just one small piece of work on this is, rather than waiting to begin to develop what are the types of products that we actually need, what's the type of information that we need if we're going to facilitate, accelerate access to critical products in developing countries. And the WHO target product profiles are just one small part of that. Another part of this is this WHO, so this is the Global Observatory on Health R&D. This has come out of the instruction from our governing body. So you know that we are the UN Health Agency, so we report to our 194 member states. They all come and tell us what to do every May at the World Health Assembly. And the dialogue at the World Health Assembly about R&D financing and coordination, and this misalignment between the R&D investments and the public health needs, one outcome of that was that we need one place globally to map information, all of the information that we need, in order to more rationally align the R&D investments with the needs. And that's the basis for this R&D observatory. And what this is doing at the moment, so now what I'm going to show you now doesn't give you really any flavor of what's available. If you have time, please do go to this link, because so who.in/research-observatory, or just Google WHO R&D Observatory and it'll take you straight there. There are all of these interactive visualizations where we have worked with the main globally available databases that have types of information that you need for R&D priority setting. So funding GFinder, which is a major set of information about R&D funding flows. Clinical trial visualizations. We have the largest clinical trials registry database. So we have a database that aggregates clinicaltrials.gov, the EU registry, and 15 others. We receive 2,000 clinical trials across all types of topic every month. We have about 425,000 last time I looked. Now with this, you can visualize all of those. So it's the one place you can go and you can see how many trials are there over time in France, because France, people are registering in different places. And actually, just from that, you see some really quite interesting findings. For example, the USA seems to be flatlining in terms of clinical trials over about the last 5 years, whereas, not surprisingly, China, for example, is going through, I don't know what the function, it's probably not exponential, but it's a more than a linear increase. So if, which is a big if, that trend continues, China will actually become the #1 place in the world for clinical trials in about 7 or 8 years' time. So what we've been asked to do is oversee this function of mapping all of this R&D, this very high-level global health R&D information, and then undertake a series of disease-specific analyses. So, and the point here is from WHO's perspective, normally we are a public health agency. So we have public health programs, we have strategies. In malaria, we have the global technical strategy. And we focus on how can we achieve the public health objectives. Here, for the first time, we are going to be focusing on the R&D agenda. So working with the WHO departments for malaria, the global malaria program, and really amplifying and aggregating the existing research priorities and R&D work so that we have a WHO R&D agenda really looking towards our public health objectives. And through this, we'll have a way to sort of bring together all of these different work streams on research priorities in WHO. This is for epidemic diseases. We have antimicrobial resistance work. We have a separate work on vaccines that I used to head up before I took over this job, on sexually transmitted infections, HIV, TB, malaria, and the NTDs. And all of this, somehow we need to find a way to come together. So I'm not even sure it's worth spending much time on this. Like I said, you need to go to the website to have a look. But these are the types of information we have: R&D funding, capacity, product pipelines. So we've been aggregating the product pipelines. Just all of this is just visualizing the best available sources. So you would know, those of you working in each area would know what they are. But this is now one place where you can go and look at hundreds of products in the pipeline across many different disease areas. And there are also visualizations on, for example, publications. And they're all interactive. So if you look at the funding one, you can click on HIV, and then this product, this is by product, and then you can see how much is going into diagnostics, vaccines, therapeutics. But you can query it and see trends over time. And this is just one other example where we're working with NLM and PubMed to visualize by disease areas geographically and over time. But there are many others, and including the clinical trials one. We're also working with the World Report, which was started by NIH, which is really the best database that we've been able to find on grants, on research grant making activities. Wellcome and the Gates Foundation and many others are part of that. And I think an important secondary objective of this is actually beginning or enhancing the discussions about harmonization of the metadata to bring in information from all of these different groups so that we can actually begin to really see what's happening. Because it's simple types of information like the name of the disease that people are funding in, it's a lot more could be done just to harmonize that type of information, which will have big payoffs, I think. This is something that I think is really important. So from GFinder, if you look at GFinder, this is on the web, their most recent report, you see that the overall funding for endemic diseases such as malaria, according to them, peaked in 2009 and has been gradually dropping. And this is the Ebola and related funding since then. So I think we cannot get into an either-or discussion here between the epidemic R&D and the endemic R&D. I mean, we clearly need both. And it seems to me that unless we can find a way to have more dialogue between these communities, we're somehow missing. And the way I would suggest that we try and do this is we come up with tangible outcomes that actually can only be enabled by this kind of dialogue, because nobody has time to just go and meet for the sake of meetings. And I mean, one clear outcome for me is surveillance. Everything that we do, as I said, is based on the information that comes to us. We need better surveillance data. We need better multiplex diagnostics that can be used at different levels of the health system. And this is critical both for, say, malaria and for signal detection for new outbreaks. So unless we can come together, somehow I think I know it's easy for me to say that, we're missing out, I think. So my conclusions would be that endemic, epidemic, and the AMR-related R&D needs overlap, but R&D communities largely work in silos, as far as I can see. And I'm not being critical, I think it's just a fact. It's great, I see a lot of multidisciplinary collaboration between economists, modelers, biologists, immunologists, which is great, but they tend to be within a pathogen space. So as far as you can somehow link across disease areas, please try and work out how to do that. We clearly need better alignment between the global health priorities that the disease burden tells us about and research investment, and we have this activity now that we've been instructed to take on. And Gina later on will be talking on some of the malaria work, which links very closely into this. We have lessons learned from Ebola that we've acted upon through the R&D blueprint. And I talked a little bit about the malaria vaccine pilots, which I see as an example of the need for a greater emphasis on implementation evaluations in low and middle income countries as new products become available. There's that URL again. And I just wanted to acknowledge our funders, as we have funders too. The DFID is the core funder of the R&D blueprint. And we have funding from the European Commission and the governments of France, Germany, and Switzerland for the R&D observatory work. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a fabulous talk, Vasee. We're going to have time for a few questions now before lunch. So would anyone like to start us off with the first question? Jake, were you indicating you want to? Oh, Gina, maybe. Okay.
So Vasee, I think you know what I'm going to ask you, but as we've been talking, you and I, about malaria, it's very clear we need a lot of different innovations, and some of them are tools. You know, whether it's a diagnostic or something that looks or acts like a vaccine, et cetera, right? But in malaria, no one really thinks that any single tool is going to conquer it all. So it gets added. It has interactions with other groups. It needs to be evaluated in different epidemiologic contexts, et cetera. And that's not necessarily product development. So how do we think about tracking that within the observatory? Because these aren't necessarily clinical trials of products, but of strategies. And that's probably a huge gap if we don't pay attention to funding the right work.
Oh, sorry, I didn't need yeah. So thanks. I mean, that's a very critical point, and I think it would be just plain wrong to not put enough emphasis, or even most emphasis, on what more can be done with the available tools. So the wording that came out of, and if I may say, I think this is something that we see, that there's an emphasis on what's going to be the new blockbuster technology or product. I mean, it's just so important that we do everything we can to make the most of the tools that we have now, and we have so much more now than we did a few decades ago. So what we will do in the R&D in this committee, so I didn't talk about the committee, but we very much want to open up as much as possible, working with the department in WHO, to highlight from them what they see as the critical research needs, which will highlight potential better outcomes from the available tools, whether that's different strategies for use of the tools or better combinations or whatever they may be. So we're completely open to that. So the way that I see this is that I would like that we, through this process, develop WHO. The R&D, I think, is the question is, what's the definition of R&D? I mean, there'll be research agendas as well as including the product development components. And the thing is, different donors, quite frankly, have a slightly different emphasis between implementation and research and product development. But what's of interest to WHO, and I think the global health community, is the public health outcomes. So we're really agnostic as to the novelty of the product is not really relevant to us. It's the public health outcome. So I hope that answers your question.
Maybe I can ask quite a practical question. So for many of us, obviously there's different interests in the room, but for many of us who are particularly interested in the therapeutic angle, so whether it's a vaccine or a drug, from your vantage point at 40,000 feet, what do you see as the key shoulder that basic research needs to conceptualize early on as the key thing that would take us from that sort of 10-year lethargic kind of approach that we always think about to a more rapid approach to a therapeutic actually getting out there and making a difference? So
Thanks.
Where do things get sort of stuck, and where could we commit to sort of getting earlier to, in which case then bodies like the WHO could say, right, you've got that data, now we can fast track you to the finish line?
Well, first of all, I think I don't want to give the impression that scientists should all be, corralled into some kind of predetermined set of projects, because I think that would be very misleading. Much of what we're using now has arisen from really blue skies science. So that absolutely has to continue. So that's the first point. I think scientists who are just interested in discovering new stuff and then putting it out there, please keep doing that. But those of you who are interested in the applications, for one thing, I think it's great if you have some time to engage in different fora where you're not only talking to other scientists, but you're beginning to talk to policymakers, regulators, different groups, because gradually you'll get an idea of what's important to them. So I think that in itself is really very valuable if you want to do that. Beyond that, from WHO's perspective, I mean, we're starting to actually provide specific guidance on the product areas, and that's what the target product profiles are. So if you're working in a product class, we're interested in expanding the development of these target product profiles, which basically lay out the types of data that we're looking for. And what's really critical there, this is now in product development, is that we think not only about initial licensure, and I mean, this is something that we all work on, but most of the industry entities, for obvious reasons, will tend to focus on licensure in the European or the North American jurisdictions. There tend to be other considerations that can lead to delays if they're not, and they can be addressed early in terms of data use. And some of those are, obvious, that if you have data only in people who are living in a totally different context, and that data isn't considered generalizable to other parts of the world where maybe the disease burden is greatest, then there's always a need for data that is relevant for the context of where the intervention is going to be used. Health economic information, I think, is already very important. It's probably going to become more important, I think, because we're beyond the era of, if you look at pneumococcal vaccine, rotavirus vaccine, there have been big steps forward where these have been adopted essentially at the global level for introduction. The real blockbuster new product, I hope we get more of those, but I'm not sure how many more we're going to get. So there's always going to be a question in many of these countries and with the donors of the overall budget envelope that's available to support new interventions. So health economics definitely important. But modelling, I think, is a really interesting area because there are lots of ways that we find modelling really important, and we work with ASRA and in a consortium sort of model where we were able to communicate what we needed, and they very much took that into account, so that there are multiple different ways to go. But it's anyone who's interested in, I mean, I think that the first point is, if you're a scientist, and I'd be interested to know, from those of you in the room, those of you who see yourselves as scientists, I would say be honest with yourself about what your objectives are. And if your objectives are discovering new stuff and then letting everybody else know about it, that's fine. I mean, just focus on that, because then the applications of that, it will filter its way through. If you're actually interested in saving people's lives, then the Nature paper is not really very relevant at the end of the day. And if that's what you're really focused on, then there's a whole other set of considerations which you can come and talk to me or others, and it seems less interesting, but over time for me it became. I moved from treating physicians and working on identifying T cell subsets in flow cytometry to convening meetings about research agendas, which to a lot of you guys would seem extremely boring, but to us we can see the value over time.
Great talk, thank you very much. It's very informative. I'm the editor of a medical journal, so I just wanted to make a couple of observations. There's no such thing as negative trial results. There's just results you didn't expect. So if it was worth doing, it's worth reporting. And I think it's actually a lot easier to get those unexpected results reported, published now than it was, because you have mega journals such as PLOS One, for example, which will publish, if it's sane, it will publish it. So it may still be tricky to get your negative findings, your unexpected findings, into a high-impact journal, but I don't think there are genuinely any barriers to publication of those findings these days.
Thanks. Which journal?
Lancet Infectious Diseases.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. It's great to hear you say that. Clearly, from the decision-making perspective, the negative trials are equally important. I think if you talk to different people, not everybody would agree with you. I'm not sure who's right, but or if there is a right here. But some people that I talk to, quite a few scientists, and I was a clinical trialist myself in the distant past, say it's just can be really very difficult to publish their negative results. So I don't know. I mean, I've also worked with PLOS ONE, and I agree with your observation that it seems like to me that there are journals where it should be equally possible to publish your negative results, such as PLOS ONE trials and others. So then I think the issue, if that is the case, the issue is incentives. And I think it's just a fact that the academic structures that we have do not incentivize us to make negative results available. And I was the same. I mean, I had less. I ended up putting one trial up on a website, and in the hope that people would see the results, because it was just totally uninteresting, and I just didn't have time to publish it. So somehow, what I think, for me, what would solve this is if researchers all felt within themselves that it was just absolutely unacceptable to have conducted and completed a research study, analysed it, have the information, and then for that information not to be available. So obviously sometimes it takes you 18 months, 24 months, whatever, to get it out there. But if everybody in their own head, a bit like a seatbelt or whatever, just felt like at some point that I need to get this out there somewhere, and everybody did that, then the problem would be solved. And as the journals, it could be through the journals, but we do have the registries now. And if anyone hasn't ever looked at the results section of clinicaltrials.gov, I would really recommend that you do that. And just as you asked that gives me an opportunity to say that in our aggregation site at WHO, which is called ICTRP, it's just who.int/ICTRP, what we've agreed with all of the registries is that they're all going to add a yes/no for whether results are available or not, and they're all going to add a link to where the results are available, whether that's the PubMed link to the journal or that's a link to the registry site, for example. And what I hope will happen is that, and as you see there's a policy movement now with the funders, is that in a couple of years, it'll be very easy for you to just do one search somewhere, like on the WHO database for, say, malaria drug trials, and then very easily see which trials are actually have been reported or not in one place. And I think that, together with the funders' incentives, hopefully will, and the fact that it doesn't take a lot of time for you to, once you've done the final analysis, to put them make them available somewhere. I think that could all come together to gradually address the problem.
Thank you. So I think we're going to have to wrap up here. Could we just have another round of applause for Vasee to say thank you?